Welcome to our deep dive into a topic that really affects all of us,
Yeah.
even if we don't realize it. The gender data gap. We're going to be taking a close look at Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And let me tell you, it is a real eye-opener.
Mhm.
You know that feeling when something just doesn't quite fit right, like the world wasn't designed with you in mind?
hmm
Well, it turns out that might not be just a coincidence.
That's exactly what Criado Perez explores in her book. She argues that so much of the world is built using data that primarily comes from men, creating a system that often overlooks or disadvantages women.
So we're not just talking about a few inconveniences here. This data gap has a real impact on women's lives.
Mhm.
And it shows up in some pretty unexpected places.
It absolutely does. To understand the scope of this, we need to go back in time and see how this bias has been ingrained in our thinking for centuries. Take the example of the Viking warrior skeleton, discovered back in the 1800s. For over a century, researchers just assumed it was male because of the weapons found in the grave. They completely overlooked the female pelvis.
Wow.
And it wasn't until 2017 with DNA testing that the warrior was confirmed to be a woman.
It's mind-boggling how easily they dismissed the evidence. That was right there in front of them. Imagine the assumptions made about women throughout history. If something this obvious could be overlooked for so long.
It speaks volumes about how deep-seated these biases are, and this isn't just limited to scientific interpretation. It extends to language itself.
Now that's fascinating. How does language factor into the gender data gap?
Well, in gender-inflected languages like German or Spanish, nouns have genders, and guess what? The masculine form is often the default, even when referring to groups of women. Think about it, even in language, women are often treated as the other, a deviation from the male norm.
Wow, I never really considered that. But it makes you realize how subtle yet powerful these biases can be. It's like the language itself is reinforcing this idea that men are the standard.
Precisely. And these subtle cues are everywhere. Criado Perez uses the example of the video game Metroid. The creators intentionally played on the audience's assumption that the protagonist, Samus, would be male. It was a huge surprise at the end of the game when her helmet came off in surprise. Samus is a woman, and not just any woman. She was wearing a pink bikini, playing into typical video game stereotypes.
That's such a great example. Even in the digital world, we unknowingly carry these biases with us. And it's not just limited to video games. This male as the default thinking has seeped into how our cities are designed as well. I'm sure many of you listening have felt that sense of unease walking alone at night, or has struggled to navigate public transportation with a stroller or heavy bags.
Those are common experiences, especially for women. And it's not just a coincidence. Criado Perez argues that much of urban planning is based on standard travel patterns. That are surprise, surprise.
Male biased, it makes sense when you think about it. Men and women often have different needs and priorities when it comes to getting around.
Exactly. The book highlights a stark example of this in Brazil's Minha Casa Minha Vida housing project. It was supposed to help those living in inadequate housing, but it ended up creating more problems, especially for women. The government relocated residents to areas far from jobs and childcare, forcing women into illegal home-based work because they had no other options.
That's a perfect example of how neglecting women's needs in the planning process can have unintended negative consequences. It's as if they designed the project assuming everyone has a car and doesn't need to worry about childcare or safe public transportation.
That's precisely the kind of thinking that Criado Perez is challenging. She contrasts this with Vienna's approach to public housing. They actively gather data on women's needs and design spaces accordingly. For example, the Frauenwerkstatt housing project prioritized safety. With well-lit walkways and clear lines of sight, they also included on-site childcare facilities, which increased women's employment rates in the community by 15%.
That's a fantastic example of how data-driven design can create a ripple effect of positive change. It's not about special treatment. It's about recognizing that different people have different needs.
Absolutely. And these needs extend beyond housing to other public spaces as well. Think about public toilets, for example.
Oh, don't even get me started on public toilets. The lines are always longer for women, and the facilities themselves are often less clean and less safe.
You're right. WaterAid reports that globally, women spend billions of hours each year just trying to find a safe place to relieve themselves. And that's not even taking into account the health and safety risks involved, especially in developing countries. It's shocking how something as basic as access to a toilet is often overlooked in urban planning.
And it's not just toilets. Parks and playgrounds often reflect this male-centric design as well. Criado Perez talks about how these spaces often prioritize activities, like skating and climbing, which tend to be more popular with boys.
This can lead to a drop in female participation, as girls might not feel welcome or comfortable in those environments. But Criado Perez also highlights cities that are actively challenging this bias. Malmö, Sweden, redesign parks and playgrounds to be more inclusive by adding smaller enclosed play areas and diversifying activities. This simple change actually reversed the trend of female underrepresentation.
It shows that creating truly inclusive public spaces is possible when you actually consider the needs of everyone who uses them.
It really does. And as we move on, we'll explore how this data gap impacts another critical area, the workplace, from ill-fitting safety gear to biased hiring practices. The consequences of this gap can be significant for women's careers and well-being.
It's amazing how this male as default thinking extends even to the equipment we use in the workplace. I'm
Right.
thinking about
Yeah.
how in fields like construction or the military, women have significantly higher injury rates.
That's right. And it's partly because safety gear and equipment are often designed for the average male body. This can create a real hazard for women, who are forced to work with ill-fitting tools and protective gear.
You know, reading that section in Invisible Women made me think about all the times I've struggled with tools that just didn't feel right in my hand. I always just assumed it was me, not the design of the tools themselves.
It's easy to internalize those experiences and think it's a personal shortcoming, but it often comes down to design choices that prioritize men's bodies and experiences. Criado Perez calls this the Henry Higgins effect, based on the musical My Fair Lady. Instead of adapting the designs to fit women, the expectation is often that women should adapt to the male-centered design.
So it's not about fixing the problem.
Yep.
It's about making women fit the existing flawed system. It's like saying the system works fine, the women just need to change.
Precisely. And this bias isn't just limited to physical design. It impacts how work is structured as well. Think about the rise of precarious work,
Okay.
like zero-hour contracts and unpredictable scheduling.
That's a great point. I've read that these types of work arrangements disproportionately impact women, especially those with caregiving responsibilities.
Exactly. If you don't have a fixed schedule or guaranteed hours, arranging childcare or managing other caregiving tasks becomes incredibly difficult. It's as if the system is set up assuming everyone has a stay-at-home partner to handle those responsibilities, which is simply not the reality for many families today.
This can have a domino effect, forcing women out of the workforce or into lower-paying, less secure jobs, simply because the structure of work doesn't take their needs into account.
And the gender data gap also rears its head. In occupational health research, the book has a fascinating example regarding BPA, a chemical commonly found in plastics. While the initial research focused on the risks of BPA exposure for babies through baby bottles,
Okay.
it completely overlooked the risks for the women working in factories, producing those bottles.
So they were worried about babies' exposure after the bottles were made, but not about the women handling high levels of BPA while manufacturing them.
It's a perfect example of how the gender data gap can lead to a lack of protection for women in the workplace. And it's not just limited to BPA. There's a surprising lack of research on the health risks women face in various occupations, from nail salons to agriculture.
This lack of data then creates a vicious cycle. If we don't have data that accurately reflects women's experiences, we can't advocate for better protections or policies.
That's why closing this data gap is crucial. We need data that accurately reflects women's needs, so we can design a world that truly works for everyone. This is especially important when we consider the role technology plays in our lives.
You know, as we move into the digital realm, I can't help but think about my own frustrations with technology. I'll admit I used to think those voice assistants were just being stubborn, but then I read about how they're primarily trained on male voices, and suddenly it all clicked. It's frustrating to think something as simple as technology can be subtly biased against you.
You're not alone. From voice recognition software to fitness trackers, technology is often designed with a male user in mind. And as Criado Perez points out, this can have serious consequences, especially in the development of artificial intelligence.
That makes sense. If the data used to train AI algorithms is predominantly male, the AI itself will reflect those biases.
Precisely. The book shares a chilling example of how this plays out with image recognition software, because the datasets used to train these algorithms are often skewed toward male images. The AI ends up reinforcing harmful gender stereotypes. It's as though the AI is learning and perpetuating the very biases we're trying to overcome.
It's almost comical how these biases show up, like how the AI might assume a woman in the kitchen is washing dishes while a man in the same setting is offered a beer.
It sounds funny, but the implications are quite serious. These biases can impact everything from hiring decisions to loan approvals. And it's not just image recognition. Language translation software can also exhibit this bias. Criado Perez talks about Google Translate's tendency to assign male pronouns to female professionals and translate gender-neutral terms in ways that reinforce stereotypes.
It's a reminder that this data gap permeates even seemingly neutral tools we use to understand the world. And speaking of tools that fail to account for women, can you talk about the Apple Health Monitoring System? I was shocked to learn about this.
That was a major oversight. They launched this supposedly comprehensive health tracker that could monitor everything from blood pressure to copper intake, but it completely omitted a period tracker. It's a classic example of how the male default can lead to a blatant disregard for women's health needs.
It's almost as if they forgot that half the population menstruates. Thankfully, there are companies challenging this bias. The book mentions Clue, a period and cycle tracking app. That takes a data-driven approach to understanding female health. What I found fascinating is that its founder, Ida Tin, had to fight against investors who thought a period tracker was too niche.
She recognized the huge gap in data around women's health and turned a niche need into a successful business. It demonstrates the demand for technology that caters to women's needs and the importance of having more women in leadership positions in tech.
This whole conversation has really made me think about the myth of meritocracy. We often hear about it in the tech world. If the playing field is already tilted against women, how can we truly talk about merit?
That's a crucial point. Criado Perez explains how unconscious bias, the lack of female role models, and a culture that often rewards stereotypically masculine traits all contribute to the underrepresentation of women in tech.
And it's frustrating to see how some companies try to address the problem. Criado Perez mentions how Google's response to low female promotion rates was to encourage women to be more like men, putting the onus on women to adapt to a male-dominated culture.
Instead of addressing the systemic issues holding women back, they essentially tell women they need to change to fit the existing system. This just reinforces the Henry Higgins effect we talked about earlier.
Clearly, we need a fundamental shift in thinking, both in how we collect data and in how we design the world around us, including the digital world.
Absolutely. That shift needs to extend beyond the individual level. We need systemic change, both in terms of policies and in how we structure our institutions.
This leads us to the most crucial area Criado Perez explores, the impact of the gender data gap on politics and economics. This is where it really hits home, affecting the very systems that govern our societies and shape our lives.
You're right. From the lack of female representation in positions of power to economic policies that fail to account for women's unpaid labor, the consequences of this gap are far-reaching. We'll delve into these critical areas after a short break.
We've seen how the gender data gap impacts our cities and our workplaces, and even the technology we use. But now we're getting to the heart of the matter, how this gap affects politics and economics. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of this problem.
Right.
Where do we even begin to address something so deeply embedded in our systems?
It's a big question, but Criado Perez offers some concrete solutions. One key starting point is increasing women's representation in politics.
That makes sense. If we want policies that represent everyone, we need more women in the rooms where decisions are made.
Exactly, and the research supports this. Studies show a strong correlation between female political representation and the passage of laws that benefit women and families. For example, in countries with higher percentages of women in parliament, we see greater investment in public education and healthcare. It's not about some inherent feminine policy agenda. It's about having diverse voices that challenge the status quo.
So it's not just about fairness or representation, it's about creating a more effective and just society.
Absolutely. But even when women break through barriers and enter politics, they often face a double standard. Criado Perez uses Hillary Clinton as an example. She was constantly criticized for being too ambitious, while male politicians with similar levels of ambition rarely face the same scrutiny.
It's a classic example of how societal expectations differ drastically for men and women.
And it goes beyond expectations. Criado Perez cites a global study by the Interparliamentary Union, which found that sexism and harassment against female politicians are pervasive. From being talked over and interrupted to receiving death threats and online abuse, it's clear that women in politics often face a level of hostility that their male counterparts rarely experience.
It's disheartening. No wonder so many women are deterred from pursuing careers in public service.
It's a real loss for society. We need more women's voices in politics to challenge those ingrained biases.
And speaking of a world that works for everyone, Criado Perez also explores the economic consequences of this data gap. One of the most striking points is how traditional economic indicators like GDP fail to account for the value of women's unpaid labor.
That's right. Women still do the vast majority of care work, both for children and for elderly family members. This work is essential for our societies to function, but because it's unpaid, it's often invisible in economic calculations. This reinforces the harmful idea that women's work is somehow less valuable than men's.
This undervaluation has real consequences. It can affect everything from government policies to individual financial security. What's the solution?
Criado Perez argues that we need to rethink how we measure economic success. We need to take into account the full value of women's contributions. This includes things like paid parental leave, affordable childcare, and policies that support a more equitable distribution of caregiving responsibilities.
Those are all critical steps toward creating a more just and sustainable economic system. But even when there's clear evidence that these policies benefit everyone, there's often resistance to implementing them. Criado Perez highlights the UK government's rejection of recommendations to increase female representation in Parliament, despite evidence of the positive impact it would have.
It's a perfect example of how challenging the gender data gap often means challenging existing power structures, and those in power are often reluctant to give up their privilege.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been eye-opening. Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the hidden forces that shape our lives.
I agree. It's a powerful reminder that data has real-world consequences. If the data we use to design the world is biased, the world itself will reflect those biases.
So what can we do? How can we challenge this data gap and create a more equitable world?
Awareness is key. Start paying attention to the data you encounter in your daily life. Question assumptions about what's normal. Ask yourself, whose voices are missing? Whose needs are being overlooked?
We need to become more critical consumers of information.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to speak up. Demand better data, more inclusive design, and policies that reflect the needs of all citizens. Support organizations working to close the gender data gap.
It's a call to action for all of us. Let's start seeing the world through a gender-aware lens and recognizing that the data we use to design our systems has a profound impact on people's lives. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it encourages you to keep learning, questioning, and pushing for a world that truly works for everyone.